The chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The press in the Bahamas have published two articles over the past week, one by Fred Smith, QC, and the other by the Nassau Institute. Both statements published information which should not go unanswered, lest the public accept the information as true and correct. They purport to describe the law and policies in the Bahamas as it relates to immigration. They go on to make assertions based on their statements of law which are incorrect. The statements published by Fred Smith, QC, on the 3rd of February in the Tribune and by the Nassau Institute in the Nassau Guardian on the 6th of February are replete with errors and untruths. The Nassau Institute claims that the Immigration Department is implementing a revised policy to grant permits and charge fees for children born here to go to school. That is false. No new fees are being introduced for immigration fees, and there is no new policy as it relates to permission for non-nationals to go to school in the Bahamas. The fee remains $100 processing fee and $25 for the issuance of the permit. The fee and the requirement for such a permit has not changed since the PLP took office in 2012. The Institute also said the Department of Immigration recently raised work permit taxes for expatriate workers, mainly professionals, to work in the private sector. That too is false. No new fees have been introduced for work permits since the PLP came to office in 2012. The Nassau Institute also said work permits for foreigners to work for the government are issued without hesitation at the stroke of a pen. That too is false. There is no requirement in law for the employees of the government who are non-nationals to have a work permit. The article also keeps speaking about people born in the Bahamas who they claim are left stateless. Stateless means that the children have no citizenship. With regard to the children of Haitians, the Haitian government has indicated that all children of Haitian citizens, wherever born, are Haitian at birth. So if that claim is being made with regard to those children, that too is false. The Nassau Institute says that the inherent danger is when immigration laws are subject to the whim of a minister, Fred Mitchell in this instance, instead of impartial law. The unintended consequences might be many as they are varied. Mr. Speaker, all laws are administered by some authority. They do not exist and apply themselves without human hands. The decisions of the Minister for Immigration are quasi-judicial and are not exercised according to whim, but in accordance with known and established policies. The principle is that work permits are issued only in circumstances where Bahamians are not available for the jobs, and the question of whether a Bahamian is or is not available for a job is certified and monitored by the Department of Labor. There is no whim of the minister exercised in this matter. Fred Smith, QC, wrote the following, quote, "The minister failed to identify any section of the Immigration or Education Act which makes the new visa rules under the new immigration education policy lawful. The new rules," he continues, "require children born in the Bahamas of foreign parents to get a student visa. In addition, the new November documentation policy is not sanctioned by law either." I answer, with regard to children born to non-Bahamian parents, Mr. Smith wrote, quote, "At 18, they are entitled to receive a certificate of registration as a citizen. Before then, they are citizens in waiting. They are not stateless, as Fred Mitchell suggests." End of quote. Mr. Smith also says of the requirement for a permit to reside for children who are non-national, the new immigration student visa policy conflicts with the Education Act. Minister Mitchell is acting ultra vires the Immigration Act, the Education Act, and the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, let me first repeat what I said at the Business Outlook seminar on the 29th of January, which is where this commentary stems from. And I said, I quote, "New rules are going to be introduced. For example, all schools will be asked to be sure that any foreign national in a Bahamian school has a student permit to be in the Bahamas as of the opening of the fall term. The annual permit costs $25 with a $100 processing fee, and every non-national should have one, including those born here to non-national parents. I said nothing about a student visa, nor did I speak to the issue of excluding students from school. Entry into school is a matter for the Ministry of Education, and the minister has already spoken to that issue. Secondly, I have never said, or ever said, or suggested that children born to non-Bahamian parents in the Bahamas are stateless. If Mr. Smith is referring to children of Haitians born in the Bahamas, the government of Haiti has affirmed that the children of Haitians born anywhere are Haitian at birth, so they are not stateless. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, there is no such thing in law as a citizen in waiting. You are either a citizen or you're not a citizen. The allegation that the new policies are ultra-virus the Constitution and the Immigration and Education Acts is false. The Immigration Act requires all non-nationals in the country to have a landed status. While the Constitution does not provide a right to apply to be registered, while the Constitution does provide a right to apply to be registered as a citizen at age 18 and before the 19th birthday to children of non-nationals born here, it confers no immigration status on them. Because they are not citizens of the Bahamas, therefore, they must have an immigration status. That means their parents should apply for them to get a permit to reside. Permits to reside cost $25 with a processing fee of $100. This is not a new fee or requirement. This is the existing law. Thousands of children hold them in this country today. This is not a new requirement. That is the existing law, and all non-nationals in the country are expected to comply with the law, and most are complying. The Department of Immigration has obtained an opinion from the Attorney General's office on this matter. We have been advised that the policies and regulations of the department are in compliance with the Constitution and all applicable laws of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Order that the communication be brought up. And order that the communication do lie on the table. The chair now will entertain the member for Fox Hill, if he's so obliged, to speak to the National Tripartite Council Bill 2014. The chair recognizes Honourable Member for Fox Hill.
First, I would, on my feet, like to, before entering the meat of the debate, to congratulate and thank the founders and progenitors of St. Augustine's College in Fox Hill, who are in the midst of, well, some of the founders have passed on, celebrating the 70th anniversary of the founding of that school. And 70 years is a long time to keep going. In speaking to the students in Barbados at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus last week, I made the point that when Dawson Conliffe handed me off from the Eastern Junior School in 1965 to St. Augustine's College into the hands of Bonaventure Dean, that was a life-changing experience for me. And I never regretted the fact that my parents made the choice for me to go to school there. And in many respects, what I am, whatever I have accomplished, came from that decision by them to go to that school. I think it remains one of the finest institutions in the country. Many of the members of Parliament who sit in this place are students of St. Augustine's College, and I wish to congratulate them on achieving the 70th anniversary and to thank them once again for an excellent education contributed to me and to the country generally. Secondly, I wish to acknowledge the interment and burial of Mrs. Paula Tynes, the wife of the Chief Clerk of the House, Mr. Maurice Tynes, at St. Anne's Cemetery on Saturday last. She was quintessential Foxhillian, and anyone who attended that funeral would see the whole assembly of Fox Hill, the village, gathered there to pay tribute to someone who they considered an exemplary model and citizen and product of the Fox Hill village. And so we mourn her passing once again and express condolences to her husband at this time. Mr. Speaker, I support this bill. I've always supported the idea of a social contract to keep the peace in society. This legislation promotes that, and it is a good idea, and I thank the minister for bringing the legislation. The non-governmental organizations like trade unions and employers associations are important to our democracy. I recall the Professor Sam Huntington, who wrote a very important work called Political Order in Changing Societies at Harvard, speaking on the important role that trade unions play in the functioning of democracy. And he used as an example the times when Ghana functioned without an elected government and was run by the military. During that time, it was the trade unions, amongst other non-governmental organizations, that represented the general interests of the people of the country when political parties were not in existence. And so one of the primary functions that a trade union has, and trade unions have evolved to have in societies generally, is the contribution which they make to raising the general standards of life in a country and speaking to the general issues of democracy and the peace and good order and governance of a country. The second and perhaps primary function they have, however, is to negotiate the terms and conditions for individual contracts of employment of workers in the workplace. And in this regard, the trade unions have historically done a creditable job in the Bahamas on behalf of workers. And I think particularly of the workers in the hotel sector who could not have enjoyed and could not enjoy today the benefits which the sector enjoys without the help and work of the trade unions in that sector. Notwithstanding our discomfort and disagreement with tactics today, and perhaps in the past, other unions have been similarly successful in raising benefits for workers. And it is the collective bargaining that gives them the power, the strength, and the authenticity to fight for the improvement of terms and conditions on behalf of workers. And we all know the historic role that they have played in the development of the democracy of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Those of you who accept the construct of the modern political life of the Bahamas, beginning with the Burma Roads of 1942 and the social reforms which came out of the Commission of Inquiry report of 1943, would understand how important labor has been to the development of our country. I reminded the students at the University of the West Indies when I spoke to them that a man named Clifford Darling from a humble settlement in Acklands came to Nassau as a migrant from Acklands and decided on behalf of the workers of the country to challenge the status quo, which led to fundamental changes in the way our country is governed. And you ask yourself, how did someone from such a humble background get the courage to take the stand that he took? And you ask yourself today why younger people with much more wealth and much more education question themselves and the ability to make changes and worry that the fact that they get involved in public life carries with it consequences. Recently, the Minister of Labor has embraced the idea of a higher minimum wage. And I am happy that this has found some resonance in the country. When I was speaking to the issue myself at a recent Bahamas Outlook seminar, and I put the question whether it is conscionable in this day and time to pay someone $210 per week at a time when we know that you simply cannot make it off $210 per week. And that, of course, is the general entry salary level of a government worker. So I'm pleased that there will be discussions on the minimum wage. During the debate last week, Mr. Speaker, there were a number of assertions made with regard to immigration matters. And immigration, as you see, is the topic du jour in the Bahamas. There was an assertion made about the revenue from immigration, referencing a comment said to have been made by the former Minister of State, pegging revenue at $64 million for the referenced year. The criticism was that this was collecting revenue from immigration fees at a level that was inconsistent with the protection of the workforce for Bahamians first. I do not agree. Let me say that the revenue up to December of last year for the Department of Immigration was some $23.6 million. The projected revenue will be about $46 million for the year. My recollection is that it has not varied much within the last 5 years. The $46 million, however, includes not just work permits, but also permanent resident fees as well. One of the products which the Bahamas government offers in its financial services sector is the so-called economic permanent residence, which costs $10,000. This is obtained where there's an investment of $500,000 or more in a home, and there is accelerated consideration where the investment is $1.5 million or more. I wish to quote from the address I gave recently at the Bahamas Outlook seminar on the 29th of January. The philosophical, and I quote, "The philosophical basis of all that we do is the fact that migration is a natural state of mankind. Mankind has been doing it for eons. If you could not make it in the place where you lived, you simply moved to another place. Today, the only caveat in the age of the nation state is that movement must be documented. This is for the safety and security of the nation state. The Bahamas has an obligation to be sure that it knows who lives within its borders and that its territory is not being used as a staging point for unlawful activity that would destabilize its neighbors. In addition, there is the concern that the cultural identity and integrity of the country is preserved. We all know that the Bahamas does not have all the skills within its borders to perform all the jobs that are required here. That means labor has to be imported to make up the shortfall. Secondly, we know that one of the important intangibles that we have to offer to the world is the right to live in the Bahamas. This is simply a beautiful place to live, and we know that living here for reasons of climate, geography, and finances makes the Bahamas an attractive place to be. The question for the Department of Immigration, for the government more generally, and our people, is at what price point to extract the premium for the right to live here, in what numbers and under what circumstances. Most advocates say that the offer to live here at a price should stop at the level of permanent residence with the possible right to work, and that as presently priced, the right to live here as a permanent resident is underpriced and therefore undervalued. Considerable work has already been done on rectifying this pricing structure as we speak, and the question is when we can convince the Exchequer and the wider government that this is a sensible direction within which to move. The present $10,000 per year fee for permanent residents is considered too low. While there has been some discussion in the civil society about economic citizenship, the idea has not found wide currency in the country and the government. I am certain that you will hear more on this subject from the new Trade Minister as she finds her way in her new office. However, I am confident that there is a new regime and pricing structure coming in the not-too-distant future with regard to the various resident products of the financial services sector. Mr. Speaker, I went on, that's the end of that quote. I went on to say at another point, and I quote, "The regular migrants and their would-be employers complain of slow services by the department. In the 2 years that I've been on the job, there has unfortunately been no appreciable change in the speed or efficiency with which the processing of applications has taken place, even as the application process has become more difficult with new rules. This is not for lack of trying, but there appears to be certain management, cultural, structural issues which defy rational thinking and attempts at change. The issue is in part the lack of manpower and the lack of equipment and the lack of money. We think that properly applied, money, equipment, and manpower can resolve these delivery issues, but we have a long way to go. There is also a need for a cultural change. The conundrum is that we believe that there is money to be found if only the pricing point to which I referred is adjusted to accurately reflect the cost of the service, but there is slow acceptance in the wider society and in the bureaucracy that this is the answer. We have received recently in this direction permission to increase the visa fees, which will more accurately reflect the cost of the service with effect from the 1st of February. That is the point to which we all ought to get with regard to all government services. The price ought to accurately reflect the cost of the delivery service. Then you will be able to fund all the inputs, and there can be no excuse for the lack of timely and rational delivery of the product or service. Indeed, one example is to be able to charge a premium for a rushed or emergency service. Mr. Speaker, that is all part of the more general discussion which the financial services sector will have on the question of what it does or does not charge for the right to live in the Bahamas. The pricing point, as I have described it, ought to maximize the economic benefits for the country by increasing government revenue, by increasing employment, and by covering the costs of the service. The MP for Montague asked a number of questions about what the trade unions were saying about a number of matters. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the trade unions actively report on immigration matters from time to time, which affect the workforces which they represent. The fact is, though, the monitoring functions for these activities, like the question of training and understudy, the abuse of Bahamians on the job, and the availability for Bahamians on the job is largely a function of the Ministry of Labor. The Department of Labor works hand in hand with immigration in monitoring these matters. I wish also to address the question of reference letters being asked for of members of Parliament. And I simply repeat that there is no request being made by ministers to have letters from MPs to get jobs. This is repeated ad nauseum over and over again from office to office, people showing up saying, I was told that you need to get your MP to give you a letter to get a job. There is no such requirement in this country for that, and I know of no minister who makes any such demand to get a letter from an MP to get a job. These letters are not a requirement. What I do say, however, is that if you look at the government's application form, it does say that the application requires references or reference letters. And often people come and ask for members of Parliament to serve as referees. So that may be where the confusion comes. Mr. Speaker, I spoke yesterday at the press club, and I wish to return to, you heard me earlier in the communication say it answers some of the issues that have arisen with regard to immigration matters, and I spoke to it earlier, it having arisen in the debate. There was an editorial which appeared in the Freeport News on Saturday, and in it, it was seeking from the government what it said was balance in its immigration policy. And I just want to assure the country that there is balance in any governmental policy, always trying to determine where the public interest is. And I want to, however, challenge all public bodies, like newspapers, to ask for the same balance when it comes to the critics of the policies on immigration. The Grand Bahama Human Rights Association, the Nassau Institute. Who are these organizations, and who do they represent? We know that there are 2 people, perhaps 3, who are publicly associated with these persons. Yet they push above their weight in cyberspace and access to public columns without checking the authenticities and the bona fides and the accuracies of what is said. I've said many times, Mr. Speaker, that the Department of Immigration has been accused of 3 things, which have been repeated in the public domain. First, institutional terrorism. Secondly, when that did not stick, they were accused of ethnic cleansing, which is a crime against humanity. When that did not work, they accused the Immigration Department of running Auschwitz in the Bahamas. Now, Auschwitz, Mr. Speaker, is a Nazi gas chamber where people were being gassed to death. There is no evidence of any of that in the Bahamas, no evidence whatsoever. Yet, these wild, unfounded claims have been repeated over and over again without challenging the assertion that a crime against humanity has been committed in this country by the Department of Immigration. There is no crime against humanity committed by the Department of Immigration. Let me say that flat out. And there is no evidence of it. So the press ought to seek some balance there, in the same way they prescribe that the government must have balance. Recently, and I repeated this story, so I repeat it here. I wake up in the morning in New York and I look down on the ground, the newspaper's in front of me, and there's a picture. And I look at it and it crosses my mind. I said, gee, that looks like a picture of some children in the Bahamas in school uniform. Didn't think anything of it. Came back from the gym, came back, picked up the newspaper. Lo and behold, it is 2 children in school uniform in the Bahamas. And the article goes on to say that we, my paraphrasing now, were making people who were Bahamians foreigners and essentially rounding them up and throwing them out of the country. Now, we wrote, the New York Times, Mr. Speaker, made 4 points to them, showing them that they had made errors of fact. Their response was on the 3rd of February to print a 1-paragraph correction in which they said that they had made an editing error, and that editing error had resulted in them saying that they were in fact Bahamian children when in fact they were not Bahamian children. The only issue, of course, is they refused in a letter written to the Consul General to go any further with that. The only problem is, once you concede that that is incorrect, the entire basis of the story falls apart. The entire basis of it falls apart. Because they went and roped in the Dominican Republic, said, you know, this is happening in the Dominican Republic as well. Well, the distinction between Dominican Republic and the Bahamas is the Dominican Republic is ex post facto taking away citizenship from people who had citizenship before up to this decision by the courts. That's not happening in the Bahamas. And nothing which we have proposed so far in this regime has anything to do with changing any laws or regulations. Everything is based on existing law and existing regulations. There may be a suggestion about a change of law, and I'd like to come to that at that point. But Section 2 of the Immigration Act, those who want to check the law, says who can be engaged in gainful occupation in the Bahamas and what gainful occupation means. And some people have been taking liberties with that. But any trade, profession, so on and so forth, that's a gainful occupation, whether you get an indirect benefit or a direct benefit, whether money passes hands or it doesn't pass hands. It covers every activity or calling. You have to get a work permit. Secondly, Section 30 gives the immigration minister or the immigration board the power and the right to give permits to reside. So if you don't have a work permit, you can get a permit to reside. And right now, a permit to reside costs $1,000. And unfortunately, the group that is born to non-Bahamian parents, that the activists are seeking, they say, to protect, the very ones that they say they're seeking to protect, are the ones they are stopping from getting the benefit of the changes we're proposing. We're trying to help them solve that issue. Because when the Constitution was written in 1973, it did not provide a status, an immigration status for those people. Right now, in order for them to get a proper immigration status, either a permit to reside if they're not students, or if they want to get a work permit, a general worker's permit, the cost is $1,000. We're proposing that we bring back in the nomenclature prior to 1973 of a belonger's permit, so that someone in that position would be able to apply for that permit at a cost of $100 and $25 for the permit, to be able to have a status pending the application for citizenship being considered. And they're all about the place, rowing and carrying on and with one thing after the next, trying to stop the very thing to help the people that they say they want to help. It confounds me. Confounds me. Defies logic. And, Mr. Speaker, the Immigration Act puts the burden of proof, just look at Section 20, it puts the burden of proof to show that you have a right to be in the Bahamas on the person that the immigration officer is speaking to. That's what it does. It puts the burden of proof on that individual to show you have a right to be in the Bahamas. That's how the law is constructed. And so, we are seeking to do the best we can to make these improvements in the law, to protect. You know, the interesting thing is, as we reach the midterm, people are saying, the Progressive Liberal Party fought on the campaign of Bahamians first. And what are they doing to show that they support Bahamians first? Well, what do you think this immigration stuff is about? It's to protect the integrity of the Bahamian workforce, to make sure that everybody who is in the Bahamas has the right to be here, either by residence or the right to work. And the whole way that Bahamians can get a benefit is because it is a special thing to be Bahamian. Only you have an unconditional right to jobs in this country. And it is offensive to me sometimes when you're sitting down and people speak about Bahamians as if they had been invited to come into the country. People come in and often they're talking to you, they start with the proposition that Bahamians can't do it, and so we're going to do our best to see what we can do to get a couple Bahamians in the job, as opposed to the other way around. That appears to be a thinking which infects so many aspects of the way we do business here. And so we've made a decision that immigration reform is key to the protection of the integrity of this workforce, so that there can be some workers for the trade unions to protect. And that's why we're working very hard. Now, people are offended because many of the constituent bodies have been trying to get meetings with me. Look, I told them, look, until we get through this, I'm avoiding any meetings because I don't want to be in no bargaining position. I'm saying, if you want to have a meeting, go to my bosses, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Prime Minister. They'll meet you anytime. You tell them whatever your complaints are, they'll tell me what to do. That's how it is. Until the back of this is broken and we get over this, then I think we can do things otherwise. But that's the general position that I put. I thank you for your indulgence, and I commend the bill.